And here we go. Okay. So I just want to welcome everyone for joining us tonight for this very important discussion, learning about part of our church history. So some of you who don't know me, my name is Allison Lawani, and I live in Tucson, Arizona. Although I've never personally met Brother Reeve, I became interested in his work several years ago. Being in an interracial marriage with a newly converted husband from West Africa, struggling with his history, I have been on a journey to learn about this subject more, to educate myself and also my family. So Brother Reeve's work has proved absolutely invaluable in my quest. So I've used his information in a Fifth Sunday lesson about the Gospel Topics essay on race in the priesthood, which, by the way, Brother Reeve helped organize information for this essay. So my goal in putting this discussion together is not to only disseminate this information to all who want to learn, starting with my own family and friends, but also to mention how one can hear and learn about really uncomfortable parts of our church history and still have a testimony of the restored gospel, and also to gain insight to change and be a better ally to this group who has been marginalized in our congregations. So I want to thank those of you who have sent in questions already and encourage any other questions in the chat box during the discussion that Brother Reeve will try to address. So please remember to keep your microphone on mute to minimize background noise. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. W. Paul Reeve, who is the Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies in the History Department at the University of Utah, where he teaches courses on Utah history, Mormon history, and the history of the U.S. West. His book, Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, received 3 Best Book Awards. In 2016, the Utah Council for the Social Studies named Professor Reeve its University Teacher of the Year. He is project manager and general editor of Century of Black Mormons, which is a digital history database designed to name and identify all known Black Mormons baptized into the faith between 1830 and 1930. The database is now live at centuryofblackmormons.org, and I'll go ahead and add the website to the chat box so you can check that out later. So thank you so much for being willing to teach us tonight, and take it away, Brother Reeve.
Thank you, Allie, and thanks for everyone who is with us tonight. I'm really thrilled to share what I've learned in doing research over the past decade. And I've sort of centered my comments tonight around lessons from the archives. So I want to just start off by, let's see, I had my PowerPoint working. There we go. Just briefly talking a little bit about the American racial context. We're going to spend most of the time talking about the Latter-day Saint context, but you have to remember that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is born into a fraught national racial context. 1830s issues of race and slavery are percolating within the nation. So it would be really remarkable to suggest that that didn't somehow have an impact on how the church develops over the course of the 19th century. So just a couple of data points. And obviously, I'm a historian. We could go into all kinds of examples. I just picked a few examples that demonstrate the way that whiteness functioned in the 19th century in the United States. To give us a sense of its power in U.S. history. So the very first Congress in 1790 passes a Naturalization Act that stipulates what is required to become a naturalized citizen in the United States. And it says to be a naturalized citizen, you have to be free and white. So just think about that. By the happenstance of your birth, if you're born white, you have a certain privilege of being able to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. Black or brown, you're not allowed to become a citizen. In fact, some in the 19th century argue that American democracy is racial. So Senator Calhoun on the floor of the United States Senate in 1848 says democracy is the government of a white race. He argues that people who are not white are racially incapable of participating in democracy. So you're excluding people who are not white from your sense of what American democracy means. And then remember 1857 in the Dred Scott decision, the United States Supreme Court actually argues that African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. No rights that white people were bound to respect. And then obviously we fight a civil war to eradicate slavery. But after Reconstruction, you have the reemergence of white supremacy, and the Supreme Court again puts its stamp of approval on white supremacy in Plessy versus Ferguson when it stipulates that segregation is the law of the land. So in all of those examples, you are giving a preference to whiteness over blackness or other colors. The other thing to keep in mind to kind of frame our conversation is social thinkers in the 19th century believed in what was called the social development theory. People like Thomas Jefferson believed in this. His notes on the state of Virginia articulate this kind of idea. They believe that all societies go through three fundamental development phases. They progress from savagery to barbarism and from barbarism to civilization. And as they do so, they leave the markers of barbarism and savagery behind. And a couple of those markers were adherence to despotic rule and polygamy, for example. Those were seen as markers of people who were not civilized. And so what you have developing in the 19th century is outsiders looking in on members of the LDS faith, people who ostensibly look white, but are doing things that true Anglo-Saxons would never do, these social development thinkers argue. And so what they suggest is that Mormonism is actually a deterioration away from whiteness. It is going backward into barbarism and even into savagery. So those ideas in mind, then look at how this plays out in the LDS racial context. So lesson number one from doing this research is simply that members of the LDS faith created an inclusive vision in the first couple of decades, meaning they welcomed all people into the Latter-day Saints community. Let me give you some evidence to support this claim. So Joseph Smith claims at least 4 revelations instructing him that this gospel must be preached unto every creature, with signs following them that believe. Latter-day Saints like to quote every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Every creature is more specific. There is no wiggle room. No one is to be left out. And at least some Latter-day Saints took that command seriously, and they welcomed into the Latter-day Saint fold people of Black African descent, Native Americans, Asians. This was a universal gospel message. You can go to 1833 with William W. Phelps, who writes an article in the Evening and Morning Star published in Jackson County, Missouri. And Phelps calls this article Free People of Color. And it's actually published to his fellow Black Latter-day Saints. What he says is Zion has been defined as Jackson County, Missouri. But you need to be aware that this is a slave state. So if you're going to immigrate and join the other Latter-day Saints in Jackson County, Missouri has a couple of provisions in its state code that determine your ability to move freely in this state. You have to have papers that substantiate your status as a free person, or else you're subject to being whipped and expelled from the state. And he actually quotes 2 sections of the Missouri State Code in this article. And then he says, so long as we, meaning Latter-day Saints, have no special rule in the church as to people of color, let prudence guide. Latter-day Saints have no special rule as to people of color, but the state of Missouri does. So just be prudent if you're going to gather here, my fellow Black Latter-day Saints, because it's a slave state. And this article is read by outsiders in Missouri, and they quickly accuse the Latter-day Saints of inviting free Blacks to the state of Missouri to incite a slave rebellion and also to steal our white wives and daughters. They project fears of race mixing onto the Latter-day Saints. This is the beginning of the Latter-day Saint expulsion from Jackson County, Missouri. They will attack Phelps's printing press, scatter it into the street, completely destroy his house and printing office, drag a couple of Latter-day Saints into the town square and tar and feather them, and that begins the process of the Latter-day Saint expulsion. And fear of race mixing is bound up in it. But I also want you to stop and also think, Phelps is saying that Latter-day Saints have no special rule in the church as to people of color. If you want to argue that the racial priesthood and temple restrictions were in place from the beginning, you have to argue against the evidence. And the evidence clearly indicates otherwise. And then we can just look at examples of people of Black African descent who are in fact being ordained and admitted into temple rituals. So Elijah Abel is probably the best known Black Latter-day Saint who was ordained to the priesthood in the 19th century. He's ordained on the 25th of January, 1836 in New Portage, Ohio by Ambrose Palmer, who is the presiding elder in that branch. Joseph Smith Jr. Actually acknowledges this ordination with his signature 2 months later on Elijah Abel's ministerial certificate. We know that Joseph Smith sanctions Elijah Abel's priesthood and perfectly approves of it. Later that year, Abel is then ordained a member of the Third Quorum of the 70 by Zebedee Coltrane. Also in 1836, he receives washing and anointing rituals in the Kirtland Temple. That's as far as temple rituals had been developed to that point. He does move to Nauvoo and is among the first to participate in baptisms for the dead in Nauvoo. Then he leaves Nauvoo, moves to Cincinnati, Ohio, and doesn't immigrate to the Great Basin until 1853 with his family. So I'm simply citing him as evidence of open priesthood and open temples. We can also then look at the way that those in Nauvoo were anticipating who would be welcomed into the city as well as into the temple. This article is published in the Times and Seasons newspaper in October of 1840 in Nauvoo. And it simply says that the saints there envisioned people of every land and from every nation, polished European, the degraded Hottentot, and the shivering Laplander flowing to the city of Nauvoo, and that they anticipated, quote, persons of all languages and of every tongue and of every color who shall with us worship the Lord of hosts in his holy temple and offer up their orisons in his sanctuary. So once again, if you want to suggest that priesthood and temple restrictions are in place from the beginning, you have to argue against the evidence because the evidence indicates otherwise. We can even go all the way to 1847 with Brigham Young. March of 1847, Brigham Young has an interview with a Black Latter-day Saint named William McCary. McCary is in winter quarters, and he is complaining about the treatment he's receiving at the hands of his white Latter-day Saints. He's experiencing racism. And in this interview, Brigham Young tries to reassure him, tells him it's nothing to do with the blood, for of one blood has God made all flesh. He's paraphrasing Acts 17:26, which operates in the 19th century among religious people to push back against the polygenesis theory, which is a pseudoscientific theory that's in operation that says, well, the races are so distinct, they are in fact separate species. And in fact, there was more than one creation because these are separate genesis or separate creations. And religious people argue against that idea because they simply say, well, that violates the biblical creation narrative. And they will cite Acts 17:26 as a rejection of the polygenesis theory. And Brigham Young is on record in March doing the same. And Joseph Smith has cited it before him in his presidential platform as well. And William McCary continues to complain about his treatment. And Brigham Young says, look, we don't care about the color. This is Brigham Young in March of 1847. And when McCary persists and he says, well, I don't have a leadership role in the faith, Brigham Young says, look, we don't even care about the color in distributing priesthood authority. And then he cites Q. Walker Lewis as an example, as evidence of this. He says, we have one of the best elders, an African in Lowell, a barber, which perfectly fits the description of Q. Walker Lewis, who is a Black priesthood holder in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch, who was ordained by William Smith, who was an apostle at the time, Joseph Smith's younger brother. And Brigham Young is on record as favorably aware of Q. Walker Lewis, calling him one of the best elders, and fully aware that he's Black, calling him an African. Okay, so even as late as 1847, this is 3 years after Joseph Smith's death, and we still have this open racial vision, even with Brigham Young saying we don't care about the color. So lesson number 2 is that outsiders look in on this universal racial vision and believe that members of the LDS faith are too inclusive of people that the rest of white society know should be excluded. Let me give you evidence to substantiate this claim. So these are just pieces of evidence that I pulled from newspapers in the Midwest as Latter-day Saints are moving through Ohio and Missouri and Illinois. And these are the complaints that are being published about them. These are not, in other words, celebrations of Mormon diversity. They are being accused of accepting, quote, all nations and colors into their godly family. One accusation against Mormon preaching in the South is that they maintained communion with the Indians and walked out with colored women. They violated the racial standards of the day, in other words. They welcomed all classes and characters into their society. They included aliens by birth and people from different parts of the world as members of God's earthly family. Mormons honored the natural equality of all mankind without accepting the native Indians or the African race. They welcome Indians and Black people into their society is one complaint that's leveled against them. They opened an asylum for rogues and vagabonds and free Blacks is a charge leveled against them in the state of Missouri. And they even promoted Black ascendancy over the whites. They don't understand the racial order. They're violating the racial hierarchy. They're even suggesting that Black people are superior to white people as one accusation in Missouri. So you understand then that this inclusive racial vision from the outside looks threatening. Mormons are welcoming people who the rest of white society knows should be segregated and even enslaved. Those are the accusations. And I love this example. Edward Strutt Abbey is a British official who's on tour of the United States in the 1830s, and he gets a copy of the Book of Mormon, and he reads it. And then he goes back to England and he publishes a 3-volume journal of his tour of the United States. And he said, hey, I met this new religious sect and I encountered their book. And it said, all are alike unto God, including Black and white. And he then said, that's an open racial vision that he predicts will make it unlikely that the saints would remain unmolested in the state of Missouri. And he proved to be prophetic on that count. Every time the Latter-day Saints are driven from Missouri, there are these fears of race mixing that are part of the accusations leveled against them as they're driven from Jackson County and then Clay County and then from the state of Missouri altogether. And especially after the Latter-day Saints openly announced the practice of plural marriage, then this fear of race mixing takes on a life of its own. And across the course of the 19th century, political cartoonists loved to imagine what Latter-day Saint families must have looked like. So this is just one example published in 1870 in John Sherwood's A Comic History of the United States, and it's simply called A Mormon Family Out for a Walk. And you'll notice the enfeebled male patriarch out front, and then the long string of wives and the seemingly endless string of children. But it's not really the number of wives and children that I want you to pay attention to. It's the de facto interracial nature of this imagined Mormon family. There's a stereotypical Black mammy from the plantation South, an Asian wife, a Pacific Islander or Native American wife, and outsiders are projecting their fears of race mixing onto the imagined Latter-day Saint families. So as outsiders imagine it, Mormon polygamy is not merely destroying the traditional family, it's destroying the white race and making it unfit for democracy. So remember, what's at stake here is not just a suspect religious group, but in fact, American democracy. And the examples I found just sort of multiply, and I only selected a few examples to show you, but the book has more examples. These political cartoons are pretty amazing. So in 1872, when Brigham Young is arrested for charges related to polygamy and hauled off to court, Frank Lindsay's Budget of Fun, which is published in New York, imagines what this scene must have looked like as he's being hauled off to court. And this illustration is simply called Affecting Parting of Brigham Young from His Interesting Little Family. But what's interesting about Brigham Young's family? Well, just notice the first wife that's reaching out to him is an African-American woman. And you have another imagined African-American wife and then mixed-race children. But even some of the white wives, notice, are drawn as evidence of the degradation of the white race that's bound up in Mormon polygamy. The upturned nose, this is meant to evoke simian or ape-like features. And in this construction, then, Brigham Young's very own family, he's presiding over the degradation of the white race. And in 1860, you have a medical doctor who files a report with the United States Senate who simply says, polygamy is giving rise to a new race in the Great Basin, and it's deformed, it's degenerate, and this is just an imagined version of Brigham Young's own interracial family. This depiction kind of changes the scenario because in this imagined depiction, it's simply called a colored Mormon. Now, instead of the white male and the interracial females, you have a black man being allowed to marry white women in Mormonism. You have to understand, in the South during this time period, this is published in 1882, you would be lynched for even looking at a white woman incorrectly. And so in this depiction, Mormons are allowing what the rest of white society knows should never happen, a black man to marry not just one white woman, but two white women, right? So projecting fears of race mixing onto the Latter-day Saints. And this goes all the way through the turn of the 20th century. This is a piece of sheet music published in 1904 by Saul Bloom's publishing house in New York. The music is actually performed on Broadway. And it's a part of this coon song genre that was popular from the 1890s through the 1920s. But this time, they actually project their fears of African Americans and Mormons, and they mix them. So it's called the Mormon Coon, and this is just the chorus. I've got a big brunette and a blonde pet. I've got him short, fat, thin, and tall. I've got a Cuban gal and a Zulu pal. They come in bunches when I call. And that's not all. I've got him pretty too, got a homely few. I've got him black to octoroon. I can spare 6 or 8. Shall I ship him by freight? For I am the Mormon Coon. So once again, fears that Mormons are facilitating race mixing and darkening the white race, making it unfit for democracy. So with that as context then, what I see taking place across the course of the 19th century is that the priesthood and temple restrictions develop in fits and starts over time. Latter-day Saints are being accused of not being white enough. And race exists as a racial ladder in the 19th century. If you're being pushed down that racial ladder, you want to climb and secure a higher rung on that racial ladder. The most significant way you can claim whiteness for yourself in the 19th century is in distance from blackness. And what we see is Latter-day Saints, Latter-day Saint leaders distancing themselves from their own black converts across the course of the 19th century, developing a racial priesthood and temple restriction in fits and starts and firmly solidified in place by 1908 under Joseph F. Smith. It will begin under Brigham Young, so that open racial vision deteriorates under Brigham Young and finally solidified in place under Joseph F. Smith. What evidence to substantiate that claim? Brigham Young, remember, is leading saints into the Salt Lake Valley in the summer of 1847. He's appointed a man by the name of William Appleby to survey the condition of the LDS Church along the East Coast in the various branches. And Appleby goes from branch to branch. By his own account, he travels over 2,000 miles that summer. And occasionally he will file a report, write a letter to Brigham Young. In June of 1847, he goes to the Lowell, Massachusetts branch. And Appleby is aghast by what he finds there. Appleby, especially according to his journal, is a racist. And he meets Q. Walker Lewis, the man that Brigham Young in March, just a couple of months earlier, was favorably aware of as a black priesthood holder. Well, Appleby meets him face to face in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch and finds out that he's ordained an elder. And he's stunned by this. He's been a member of the church for 7 years, and he says in his letter to Brigham Young, I wish to know if this is the order of God or tolerated in this church, i.e. to ordain Negroes to the priesthood. And then his second question is, and allow amalgamation. Because Q. Walker Lewis's son Enoch is also a baptized member of the faith, but he's married a white woman, Mary Matilda Webster, and they have a child together. And the pre-Civil War word for race mixing was amalgamation, borrowed from metallurgy for the mixing of metals. And William Appleby is stunned by this, and he says, if this is our policy, I desire to know it as I have yet got to learn it. Then we get a sense of his true feelings because he writes in his journal that night, I met Enoch Lewis. He's black and he's a Latter-day Saint and he's married to a white woman and they have a child together. And he says, I've never been so disgusted in all my life. Oh, woman, where is your shame? And he's disgusted that a white woman has married a black man. And he's disgusted that they have a child together. And he's disgusted that they are a member of his faith. So he sends that in a letter to Brigham Young. He won't actually meet Brigham Young until the 3rd of December, 1847, when he delivers his report in person. Brigham Young has been to the Salt Lake Valley, returns back to winter quarters, gets William Appleby's report. And we only have 13 surviving lines of the minutes of that meeting, but those 13 surviving lines are drenched with fears of race mixing. There's no mention of priesthood at that meeting, but Brigham Young speaks out stridently against race mixing. And he seems to be borrowing from Josiah Nott, who's a racist thinker in the 19th century, who has published articles who said, if we allow race mixing, it will create sterility in the next generation. And it's a horrible thing to do, and it darkens the white race, and democracy is at stake. And Brigham Young seems to be basically arguing the same thing, actually advocating capital punishment for the penalty for race mixing. So the next time that Brigham Young speaks out then is in 1852, and it's the first known public articulation by a prophet president of the church of the racial priesthood restriction. And it takes place during the Utah territorial legislative debates over a voting bill as well as black slavery in the territory. So white enslavers have converted. Some of their slaves have converted, and they have migrated to Utah territory. The territorial legislature in 1852 is meeting to decide what rules will regulate the relationship between the white enslavers and the black enslaved. And a debate ensues. And this is when Brigham Young first publicly articulates a racial priesthood restriction. And his most forceful articulation comes in his speech on the 5th of February, 1852. And it's in a debate with Orson Pratt. Orson Pratt is arguing that the servant code, which would legalize slavery in Utah territory, be rejected outright. He's disgusted that his fellow legislators would even contemplate this. He says there's no legalized slavery in this territory. Why would we do this? Why would we legalize this? He argues that curses are not multi-generational. They may be given by God, but they don't pass down. They're not multi-generational. And he says, shall we then take the innocent African that has committed no sin and damn him to slavery and bondage without receiving any authority from heaven to do so? He found the idea preposterous and said it was enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. He also advocates for black male voting rights in 1852 in Utah Territory. And understanding that, then you understand Brigham Young speaks back stridently against Orson Pratt in his 5th of February speech. And he says, black people will not rule over me in Utah Territory, meaning we will not give them the right to vote. And they will not rule over me in this church, meaning they won't have the priesthood. And it's a strident stand that wins out over Orson Pratt. So one thing to keep in mind then is that they had choices. And Orson Pratt gives them a choice. He says, let's reject this slave code. And they choose otherwise. And Orson Pratt never mentions priesthood, but he does argue against multi-generational racial curses, and actually argues in favor of black male voting rights in 1852 Utah. So we see that Brigham Young's statements come out of a debate with Orson Pratt, who is a member of the legislature as well as an apostle. And remember, Brigham Young is governor of Utah Territory as well as president of the LDS faith. So those roles are mixing. The next time, when I say that the priesthood and temple restrictions develop over time in fits and starts, it's because we have these moments where the leadership is deciding what to do. And the next moment is 1879. Elijah Abel, his wife has passed away in 1877, and he appeals to receive his endowment ritual in the temple, as well as to be sealed to his wife posthumously by proxy. And this 1879 appeal goes to John Taylor, who is then leader of the faith. So as late as 1879, if the racial, priesthood, and temple restrictions are unambiguously in place, why does John Taylor, the leader of the faith, have to conduct an investigation? That's in fact what he does. He sends Joseph F. Smith to interview Elijah Abel, and these notes are written in Joseph F. Smith's hand. And these notes were recently, within the last year, discovered in the Joseph F. Smith papers and released by the LDS Church History Department. So the belief is that when Joseph F. Smith goes to interview Elijah Abel, these are the notes that he takes from that interview. And Abel gives him the details of his priesthood ordination in these notes, and tells him who did his washing and anointing in the Kirtland Temple, and provides for him all the details. And Joseph F. Smith goes back to that meeting with John Taylor and says, look, Elijah Abel has evidence of his priesthood status. John Taylor's decision is that Elijah Abel's priesthood will be allowed to stand, but they decide they will not allow him into the temple. And so you have the development of a temple restriction. Elijah Abel will then go on a third mission for the faith. He's in his 70s. He returns back in 1884, and he dies within 2 weeks. And his obituary is published in the Deseret News. I don't know who wrote that obituary. Whoever it was aware of the shrinking space for Black Latter-day Saints in their own faith. Because it's not a typical eulogy. It's really a recitation of Elijah Abel's ordination certificate dates. And I think this person who wrote the obituary is trying to speak not just to his generation, but to the ages. Look, he was a faithful Black priesthood holder. These are his certificate dates, and he died in full faith in the gospel. Don't deny his faith and his contribution. The next time the LDS leadership responds to a variety of questions that come in between Elijah Abel's death and the turn of the century. I remember Jane Manning James, the day that Elijah Abel dies, starts her appeals for temple admission. She picks up the cause and doesn't relent, and she dies in 1908. In 1907, the LDS First Presidency decides that the descendants of Ham, who they are meaning black people, may receive baptism and confirmation, but no one known to have in his veins Negro blood. It matters not how remote a degree. So there's the one drop policy. No matter how much African ancestry they might have, they will be excluded, can either have the priesthood in any degree or the blessings of the temple of God, no matter how otherwise worthy they may be. So you understand then that policy says worthiness is not what's at stake here, race is what's at stake here. A white person and a black person can't answer the temple recommend interview exactly the same. A white person can go to the temple, a black person can't, even though they are perfectly worthy simply because of the color of their skin. And that's an act of racism. And I believe the restriction is finally solidified in place in 1908 under Joseph F. Smith. Jane Manning James passes away. He speaks at her funeral. And then they receive a letter from the mission president in South Africa who says, we baptized a Zulu chief. He wants to take the gospel to the rest of his group. What do we do about that? And what we see in this 1908 meeting is Joseph F. Smith's false memory. So remember, it's Joseph F. Smith in 1879 who interviewed Abel and defended his priesthood as valid. In 1895, in another meeting, he reminded LDS leaders that Abel was ordained to the priesthood at Kirtland under the direction of Joseph Smith. And then the slippage starts. In 1904, he called Abel's ordination a mistake that was never corrected. And then in 1908, in response to this mission president in South Africa, he claimed that Abel's priesthood ordination was declared null and void by the prophet Joseph Smith himself. So why I think this is important is because it puts a new memory in place. This is the last brick in this wall of segregated priesthood and temples. So you create a new memory for the 20th century. You say that priesthood and temples were always white. They were white from the beginning. God put the restrictions in place. Human beings can't do anything about it, and it will take a revelation to get rid of. And that becomes the new memory for the 20th century. And in fact, it does take a revelation to get rid of 70 years later. So that's a part of the process of Mormons claiming whiteness for themselves, is distancing themselves from their own Black Latter-day Saints. And I believe that's firmly solidified as you erase from collective Latter-day Saint memory the Black priesthood holders and the Black pioneers who complicate the new white story. And at the same meeting then, Joseph F. Smith decides that missionaries, quote, should not take the initiative in proselyting among the Negro people, but if Negroes or people tainted with Negro blood apply for baptism themselves, they might be admitted to church membership in the understanding that nothing further can be done for them. So remember, Joseph Smith received 4 revelations saying, unto every creature. Now in 1908, Joseph F. Smith is saying, stop proselyting amongst Black people. So you understand how the LDS faith comes to be known as a white church, because they make deliberate decisions in the early 20th century to stop proselyting amongst Black people. And then the last lesson, Latter-day Saints went from not white enough in the 19th century to too white by the 21st century. That's the overarching arc of my argument. So perceived as not white enough in the 19th century. And how do you claim whiteness? Well, in distance from Blackness. By the 21st century, outsiders perceive Latter-day Saints as too white. Just one piece of evidence on this count: when Mitt Romney was running for the presidency in 2012, Lee Siegel wrote an op-ed in the New York Times calling him the whitest white man to run for president in recent memory. Now, all presidents of the United States have been white up through President Obama, but Romney's Mormonism made him too white. So from not white enough to too white, and then how do you claim a more racially diverse and international identity for yourself? Well, the I'm a Mormon media campaign, I think, was designed to do just that. So in the 21st century, Latter-day Saints trying to claim a more racially diverse and international identity for themselves. And before she decided to run for Congress in Utah, one of the people featured in that I'm a Mormon media campaign was Mia Love with her white husband. So they actually chose an interracial couple to represent the 21st century face of Mormonism, whereas remember in the 19th century, Brigham Young argued stridently against race mixing. So that's the overarching arc of the argument, just how I see the Latter-day Saint racial story, from not white enough to too white, and claiming whiteness for yourself in the 19th century and distance from blackness, and by the 21st century, trying to claim a more racially diverse and international identity for Latter-day Saints. So as you guys signed up for this, some of you entered questions. And so I just cut and pasted some of those questions into the PowerPoint, and I'm happy to just talk through some of those questions. So this is the question I most frequently get when I talk about race and the Latter-day Saint faith. How can I trust current revelation? How can I cope with my faith and my children's in the future when the institution is reluctant to correct past misinformation? They never apologize or correct false information. It just trickles out. How can I defend this? Why do I feel like I have to? And I think this question really gets at the heart of the issue, notions of prophetic fallibility, and how do we trust people who we revere as prophets. I'm going to share with you how I view that, and I'm not saying that my answer is correct, right? But just share with you one of the ways that I think about that very question. In my sense is sometimes Latter-day Saints place leaders too high on pedestals. And sometimes feels almost like leadership worship. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we do that. I think it's okay to let them be human beings, and also figure out for ourselves, not cede our moral obligations over to other human beings. And the interesting thing is that Brigham Young, seen as a strict authoritarian, is on record actually arguing this point. What a pity, he says, it would be if we were led by one man to utter destruction. Are you afraid of this? I am more afraid that this people have so much confidence in their leaders that they will not inquire for themselves of God whether they are led by him. I am fearful that they settle down into a state of blind self-security, trusting their eternal destiny in the hands of their leaders with a reckless confidence that in itself would thwart the purposes of God in their salvation. So you get a sense from Brigham Young, he's arguing against blind self-security, that we have an obligation to find out for ourselves. And you can go all the way to Elder Holland, where he reminds us that we should be kind regarding human frailty, our own as well as those who lead us in the church. He reminds us that we're led by volunteer mortal men and women. And except for the case of Christ, we're all imperfect. It must be terribly hard for the Lord to deal with that, but he does, and asks us to also be kind and generous on that count as well. And then I also wish that we actually engaged D&C Section 1 a little bit better than we do. It's called the Lord's Preface to the Doctrine and Covenants. It was actually received, Joseph Smith claims to receive this in November of 1831 as they're collecting the revelations he had received to that point and getting ready to publish them as the Book of Commandments. And he receives this revelation and it becomes the preface to the Doctrine and Covenants. And I imagine the Lord simply thinking back over the previous generations, the dispensations, and thinking back about Moses killing the Egyptian and burying him in the sand, and then being later called his prophet. Judah sleeping with his daughter-in-law, David and Bathsheba, Peter, who denied knowing the Savior 3 times, Judas, who betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. What do I want people in the last dispensation to know? Verse 24, behold, I am God and I have spoken it. These commandments are of me, meaning the revelations that are going to be published. They were given unto my servants in their weakness. So my servants in the last dispensation are weak, and inasmuch as they erred, it might be made known, they're going to err. And inasmuch as they sought wisdom, they might be instructed. And inasmuch as they sinned, they might be chastened. My servants in the last dispensation are going to be weak, they're going to err, and they will sin. And yet, in verse 30, the only verse that we like to quote, you're going to be led by weak, error-prone sinners, and the church that they preside over is the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth, with which the Lord am well pleased, speaking under the church collectively and not individually. Okay, it's not an either-or proposition. In other words, you can be led by weak, error-prone sinners, and yet the sum of the whole is greater than its parts. And he's speaking under the church collectively, meaning the leaders and the body of Christ makes it a true and living church. So all of those are things that I like to keep in mind when I think through notions of prophetic fallibility. That we have simply been promised that we will be led by weak, error-prone sinners, and we should, have faith and patience as we engage in our stumbling walk with God. And next question was, if you have time, could you discuss slavery in Utah and the other Western LDS communities? So I briefly mentioned the 1852 territorial legislature. Let me just tell you what the Act in Relation to Service did. So what type of law did the legislature pass? What did it stipulate, and what choices did they have? The Act in Relation to Service, I'm working on with a couple of my co-authors, Legine Caruth and Christopher Rich, a documentary history of this legislative session so that we can publish the documents related to it. We actually found the original draft of this bill, and the argument that we'll make is that the Act in Relation to Service was a conservative form of gradual emancipation, patterned after, for example, Pennsylvania's gradual emancipation law. It's conservative because it frees no one then a slave. And I know that sounds ridiculous. We like to think only in terms of free and slave. But in the 19th century, gradual emancipation laws in states that we consider free states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, all had some similar form of gradual emancipation where it frees no one then a slave, but starts to free the next generation. And that's, in fact, what Utah's law does. You'll notice the part of the bill that is highlighted in the dark color would have made the bill perpetual. It would have passed on the condition of servitude to the next generation. But we found the original version of the bill, and you'll see that it's that sentence, that clause, is actually crossed out. So they scribbled that out before they passed the bill, which means that the condition of servitude will not pass to the next generation. So those who are brought into the territory as enslaved people will die as enslaved people, but their children will not be enslaved. So the rising generation would have become free. Now, it doesn't actually get to play out that way because Congress outlawed slavery in the territories in 1862. Not the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a bill passed specifically for the territories, not the states. Congress says we have power over the territories and we can do this just by legislative act, and they outlawed slavery in the territories in 1862. So Utah's slaves were freed by Congress in 1862. So for 10 years, this bill would have been in effect. What do the provisions of the bill stipulate? They prohibit black-white sex. So this is designed to prohibit, white enslavers raping their enslaved women, but also just prevents all black-white sex in Utah territory. So fear of race mixing, remember, is animating Brigham Young. Enslavers are required to provide comfortable habitations, clothing, bedding, sufficient food, and recreation, and not be guilty of cruelty or abuse or neglect to feed, clothe, or shelter their servants. Enslavers cannot take enslaved out of the territory without permission of the enslaved. And it stipulates that if a enslaver wants to take an enslaved out of the territory, the enslaved person has to give consent without the enslaver in the room to a probate judge. And the penalty is $5,000 or up to 5 years imprisonment. And the enslavers are required to send their servants or the enslaved people to school to get an education for 18 months. Now, if you're familiar with slave codes in the South, they actually prevent enslaved people from gaining an education simply because knowledge is power. And they Southern enslavers stipulated that white enslavers couldn't educate their slaves, couldn't teach them to read and write. Utah's servant code requires the enslavers to do so. So it is distinct, and the provisions of the bill are aimed at regulating the white enslavers, not the black enslaved. But nonetheless, it allows for slavery to exist for 10 years before Congress passes it. What choices did they have? Well, federal Judge Zerubbabel Snow in 1852 actually says they have a choice. The Territorial Organic Acts included a clause giving to the people here the right to introduce slavery or reject it. And remember that Orson Pratt argued that the legislature should reject it. He's an LDS apostle and a legislator, and he speaks out stridently against this bill. Shall we introduce this evil into our midst? No. I hope there is wisdom, light, and intelligence enough within the bosoms of this honorable council to spurn the idea with indignation. When in our situation we are legislating in the capacity of people who desire to serve God, in the capacity to be the most benefit to the nations abroad, is it not known to this honorable council the light in which slavery is looked upon by almost every enlightened nation or heathen? They look upon it with disgust. And he's basically reminding legislators that, for example, the British Empire has enacted emancipation, compensated emancipation, where they pay the enslavers, the white enslavers, for their loss of property, but nonetheless emancipation. And so he's saying, why would we enact slavery in Utah Territory when it's on its way out around the globe? Wherein can it be expedient for us to suffer slavery to come into this territory when we can avoid it? It would not be a sin to keep it out. Shall we hedge up the way before us by introducing this abominable slavery? And Brigham Young, like I mentioned before, speaks out stridently. And this is Brigham Young on the 5th of February. And, his speech on the 5th of February is just simply drenched with racism. Remember, Orson Pratt is also arguing for black voting rights. And so Brigham Young says, we just as well make a bill here for mules to vote as Negroes or Indians. You cannot find within men upon the earth who are of the seed of Cain any that possess knowledge and sensibility enough to vote. What we are trying to do today is to make the Negro equal with us in all our privileges. My voice shall be against it all the day long, he says. And then the same speech, if there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ spoken before, I tell you this, people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of Cain. I know they are. I know that they cannot bear rule in the priesthood in the first sense of the word. Now, I think it's important to at least acknowledge the first part of this sentence. If there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ spoken before. Brigham Young is acknowledging that he's the first. So once again, if you want to say this is in place from the beginning, you have to argue against the evidence. And Brigham Young himself says, okay, if no one else said it before, I'm saying it now in articulating a priesthood restriction. Okay, next question. Maybe talk a little bit about Brazil. So I'm assuming this question really has to do with the June 1978 revelation. And I think Brazil is really important in laying the groundwork for what takes place in June 1978. So remember that you have people in Nigeria who have found Latter-day Saint literature in the Book of Mormon who are basically converting without missionaries there to baptize them and writing letters into the church. So if you're a believing Latter-day Saint, then what's really taking place is the Spirit is converting people. The Spirit is converting Black people and creating pressure points. And Nigeria is one of those locations where you have entire congregations who are calling themselves Latter-day Saints, even though they haven't been baptized. You also have a mixed race population in Brazil, and at least initially, Latter-day Saint missionaries there tried to concentrate their efforts to those of European descent. And they would actually endure approaches, or as they started to teach people, say, hey, here's a picture of my family. Can I see a picture of yours? And if they noticed people of Black African descent in family photos, they would move on. So really Brazil, because of its mixed racial heritage, was presenting difficulties. And the LDS leadership announced a temple in Brazil. And you have LDS leaders who fly down to Brazil and meet faithful Black Latter-day Saints who are giving their money to a building they know they will not be allowed to enter. And Mark Grover, who has written about this, basically argues that really the question then becomes not how will we keep people of mixed racial ancestry out of the temple in Brazil, but what can we do to ensure that they can be let in? And by the time the temple in Brazil is dedicated, it's after June of 1978, and Black Latter-day Saints are in that temple dedication. So I think Brazil is also an important facet in movement towards the June 1978 revelation. And there are cases in Brazil, and I'm just noting this Journal of Mormon History article. I have it as a PDF, and I'm happy to send it to anyone. But it talks about these racial cases in the 20th century in Latin America. So one person who was serving as a branch president, for example, discovers his racial ancestry. They release him as branch president. They don't revoke his priesthood. They just ask him not to exercise it. And then after the 1978 revelation, they just tell him to freely go about exercising his priesthood. They don't reordain him, in other words. So Brazil is creating, some of the questions that the LDS leadership are trying to answer. And so I think it's the international church, really, that is also helping to produce what happens in June of 1978. Other questions. I'm linking these two questions kind of together. And the first one is a little bit specific. How does John McWhorton, who is a professor at Columbia, African-American professor at Columbia, is a linguist, but has announced that he's going to be writing a new book. And he said the new book is going to be that anti-racism is a religion. And so I'm not quite sure what he means by that because the book isn't out. And so can't quite get into his head. But I think this question relates to the next question. In addressing past racial struggles, how should contemporary American Latter-day Saints prepare for and embrace greater multiculturalism, both within the church and around the Mountain West? What are some suggestions on confronting social cultural issues in the church without clashing with leadership and causing inadvertent conflict with less learned or more monocultural or politically far-right members? So I think, these are great questions. How do we actually navigate this? And I think we have to, first of all, know the history so that we are on firm ground. And I think we have to remember, right, that speaking under the church collectively, not individually, the true and living church is us collectively, meaning it's our church as well. And it's okay for us to speak up. It's okay for us to articulate racism when we see it, and to articulate racism as a sin, because our leaders have articulated racism as a sin. And we should be willing to speak up, to stand against it. If we hear the old racial teachings being promulgated in Sunday school or priesthood or Relief Society, we should be aware of the gospel Race in the Priesthood essay, which disavows those old teachings, and disavowed by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. And all racism, including within the church, has been condemned. So we should be willing to articulate that and speak out about it and educate ourselves and, in my sense, be a force for good. Next question. Maybe this has already been asked or addressed. Let's see, interested in more about Elijah Abel. So in the presentation, I covered most of Elijah Abel in addressing this question. And let me say that the database, centuryofblackmormons.org, if you go there, you can read our biography of Elijah Abel, and it's filled with footnotes, and then we also load every publicly available document into the documents reader at the bottom of the biography. So you can bring yourself up to speed on Elijah Abel. One thing that I see taking place is people sometimes try to dismiss Elijah Abel and his priesthood. They try to suggest that, well, he was mixed race and light, and so people didn't really know him as a person of Black African descent. In our essay, our biography at Century of Black Mormons, we give evidence to the contrary. In 1843, there's a conference in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Elijah Abel was living, and two LDS apostles preside over that conference. And they single Elijah Abel out, and they say to him, we don't think it's wise for a Black ordained member of the 70 to preach. And remember, the 70 in the 19th century was a missionary office. So we don't think it's wise for a Black 70 to preach to white people. Why don't you confine your preaching to members of your own race? And Elijah Abel says, I'm not trying to assert myself over white people. I'm aware of the racial hierarchy. And he says he will preach amongst Black people. I'm citing that to say that Latter-day Saints apostles in 1843 understood and recognized him as a Black priesthood holder. They called him colored in the minutes of that meeting. So when I see in the 21st century people trying to dismiss Elijah Abel, oh, he was white, he passed as white, the evidence doesn't substantiate that. And there are people in our database who do pass as white, and we follow them across different census records, for example. So in one census record, they might be mulatto. The next census record, they might be white. Their death certificate might be white. I just pasted into the screen here Elijah Abel's death record just to substantiate that all the way through his death, he is understood to be a person of Black African descent. You'll notice then in that column, in his death record, they call him colored. So all the way through his life as a Latter-day Saint, he is completely understood to be a Black priesthood holder. So that's something also to consider about Elijah Abel, is that the stories that you hear trying to dismiss him or suggest he passed as white, or that somehow, certainly he was lighter and he is of mixed racial ancestry. All of that's true. But he was understood to be a Black priesthood holder by leaders and all the way through his death. How can we as members navigate this uncomfortable history and use it to strengthen rather than weaken our testimony? And if you were to make an educated guess, would you say the ban was more for becoming whiter, political, or fear of race mixing? I'm going to address the second question first. I think basically they're saying the same thing. Fear of race mixing is also political, and becoming whiter is political. Almost every state in the nation has laws against race mixing in the 19th century. And remember, in a lot of political thinkers' minds, American democracy is at stake because they believe people who aren't white are incapable of democracy. And so race mixing is one way that you preserve the white race and preserve American democracy. So I think fear of race mixing really is at the heart of Brigham Young's shift from where he was in 1847 when he says we don't care about the color to where he is in 1852 when he clearly cares about the color. And that 5th of February speech, there's a long section in there about race mixing. And he says, hey, if all the elders of the church were to mix with the African race, the church would be in ruins. No one could hold the priesthood. And so I think fear of race mixing really animates Brigham Young's racial restriction. But it's also political because of what race mixing means in the 19th century American political context. The other question is, well, how do we navigate this uncomfortable history and use it to strengthen rather to weaken our testimony? I like to use Ezra Taft Benson, who was an apostle at the time when he gave this talk in 1975. And he called it the Samuel principle. And basically he says, well, he uses, the Old Testament, and the children of Israel come to Samuel and say, we want a king. We want to be cool like the surrounding societies. And Samuel rejects that notion, and they keep applying and appealing for a king. And finally, remember, God says, well, Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they rejected me. Give them a king. And Elder Benson says, this is the Samuel principle. Within certain bounds, God gives us what we want and lets us suffer the consequences. And for the children of Israel, that's a 400-year-long consequence of monarchy and idol worship and all of the various consequences that come along with it. Think about the Samuel principle in relationship to the last 116 pages of the Book of Mormon. God gave Joseph Smith what he wanted, and gave Martin Harris the 116 pages, and let Joseph Smith suffer the consequences. He told Joseph Smith that he had sinned, that he cared more about man than he did about God, and Joseph Smith lost his ability to translate for a while. Think also about the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Institution, founded in Kirtland. Latter-day Saints believed they had assurances from Joseph Smith that the bank wouldn't fail. They invested in the bank. It failed. And historians call it the Kirtland apostasy. A lot of even Joseph Smith's closest associates called him a fallen prophet. Why wouldn't God just simply say, hey, Joseph Smith, that's a bad idea. Don't found that bank. It's going to cause all kinds of problems. He lets Joseph Smith make his own decision and suffer the consequences. When God makes a prophet, he doesn't revoke his agency. Agency is a fundamental part of the plan. And if a prophet has agency, a prophet can make mistakes. President Uchtdorf reminded us of that. We have made mistakes. So in my estimation, the Samuel principle can help us make sense of this. I don't believe, in other words, that God implemented the racial, priesthood, and temple restrictions. He let Brigham Young say what Brigham Young said on the 5th of February, 1852, and he let us suffer the consequences. And I believe those consequences continue to exist, especially amongst white Latter-day Saints who might continue to harbor notions of white supremacy, harbor notions that white people are somehow superior, that the racial restrictions were somehow divine origins, and that black skin is a curse. All of those kind of things are consequences of this. And so I think we need, to understand the history and be humble and be willing to listen to our fellow Black Latter-day Saints and understand that their experiences and perspectives are different from our experiences and perspectives. Growing up Black in the United States is different from me growing up white in the United States. And be willing to acknowledge that, be willing to stand in places of empathy with our brothers and sisters, be willing to fulfill our baptismal covenants with our brothers and sisters instead of acting like there is no racism in the church or in the United States. Listen to their experiences. Because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it doesn't exist and that it isn't true. How do we explain continuing issues over racism within the church? And I'm linking all three of these together. Do you see a link between policies, attitudes on race, and a colonialism approach to missionary work? Meaning we're sort of superimposing our white Utah culture on the rest of the world. So my answer is yes. And then what's a path forward from here? And I'm going to share with you just some examples to answer these questions, right? How do we explain continuing issues over racism within the church? And the third question talks about growth in the church in other locations, South and Central America, in Africa. And, sometimes we struggle in the United States amongst African Americans because of the racism that they encounter in the pews. And so how do we deal with all of that? And to address this question, I'm going to show you some of the evidence that we have uncovered in our research for Century of Black Mormons, where we're naming and identifying all known people of Black African descent baptized into the faith in the first 100 years. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has always said they have never kept membership records according to race. And that's true. There has never been a membership record with a category for race. But what we've discovered in doing our research is that clerks and missionaries who kept these baptismal records sometimes couldn't help but note when they baptized someone who was Black. So let me just show you the evidence in the screen here. So the top one is Nettie Kirchhoff, who was baptized in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. She's a founding member of the Oshkosh, Wisconsin branch. She becomes the first Sunday school secretary in that branch, and she will later teach Sunday school. This is her LDS census record in 1925, and you'll notice that the clerk, there's no category for race, but the clerk writes colored in parentheses next to her name. And then you'll notice John Burton. He is born into slavery in Virginia in 1797. With his enslavers in Missouri, he converts to the LDS faith. He goes to Nauvoo, to winter quarters, to Utah. He's among the Black pioneers in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, sent by Brigham Young to found Parowan, Utah, in southern Utah. When the local leadership decides it's time to build a church, they ask for donations. And John Burton, you'll see here, gives $15 for the establishment of the first church in Parowan, Utah. He's buried in the Parowan, Utah cemetery. Born into slavery in 1797 in Virginia and buried in Parowan, Utah, contributes $15 to the building of the first church there. And the clerk, as he takes his donation, writes African next to his name. And then Henry Barr, just another Black Latter-day Saint, baptized in, I believe, North Carolina. And you'll notice when the missionary enters his name into the baptismal record, he writes colored next to his name. And just a couple of other examples. This is the Salt Lake City 8th Ward, and Susan and Ned LeGrone, who were enslaved before the Civil War, immigrate to Utah in 1870, get baptized in 1873. Next to their record, colored. I'm showing you this to just simply demonstrate that as Latter-day Saints, and I think as Americans, white is seen as normal. White is seen as normal. There is, in the records that we look at, no white person is ever identified racially. Black people and Native Americans are sometimes written in the margins, colored or Indian or Native American. What that teaches us is that white, as Latter-day Saints, we assume white is normal, and sometimes we then think that anything that's not white is a deterioration away from normal or a curse. So how do we overcome this? We have to re-educate ourselves. I still hear stories about white Latter-day Saints telling Black Latter-day Saints, oh, won't it be great in the next life when you're white like me? Do you understand how offensive and horrifying that is? Not a hair of our head will be lost in the resurrection, but a fundamental part of our Black brothers and sisters' identity will be erased because you assume white equals normal. So how do we deal with the continuing racism? I think I've long said the church's racial problem is a whiteness problem. White people sort of growing up with notions of divine curses, black skin, dark skin as a curse, and the assumption that white is normal. We are all children of God who sees us all alike and all equal. That doesn't mean that one skin color is more normal than any other skin color, in other words. We're all equal and alike unto God. And that, I think, has to be a part of the solution in the present. So where else do you see that we have tried to blend in with mainstream American Christianity at the cost of our true beliefs and ideals? I think, the turn of the 20th century, as we attempt to mainstream, we start to, I think, buy into some evangelical sort of notions of biblical inerrancy, even though Joseph Smith says, we accept the Bible as follows, it's translated correctly. We start to sort of borrow some of evangelical Christianity's beliefs, I think, in our effort to mainstream. And other scholars have studied that much more than I have. The other question is, during Joseph Smith's lifetime, most states had harsh laws about mixed racial marriages, including all the southern states, plus the states of Illinois and Ohio. How do you think these laws affected Joseph's statements about race issues, his behavior as mayor of Nauvoo? Well, I think they have a direct impact. That's one thing that's consistent across LDS leaders. So Joseph Smith also is against race mixing. I think every LDS leader up through Spencer W. Kimball is against race mixing. I think that makes them more American than it does uniquely Mormon. It's a part of the American racial context. Remember that the Supreme Court doesn't strike down anti-miscegenation laws until Loving versus Virginia in 1967. Utah had revoked its anti-miscegenation law 4 years earlier, 1963. But in any case, I think that directly has an impact. There, in the minutes in Nauvoo, the minutes tell us that a couple of people are fined for applying for marriage licenses that would have been mixed race. So it's prevented in Nauvoo. And I think the American racial culture absolutely has an influence on the way that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and other LDS leaders think about race mixing. But remember, it's Brigham Young who articulates a fear of priesthood, loss of priesthood as a result of that. We don't have that with Joseph Smith. And then these questions are grouped together. One person says, we lived in England for a couple of years. I'm hearing from friends there that the church leadership are speaking out about police brutality and the history of racism in the church. But here in America, our local leadership is silent. In fact, they claim that they can't comment on anything political. How can we change this culture of silence? How do you suggest having conversations about race with those who think that racism isn't a problem? And through all of these events concerning the Black Lives Matter movement, I have been wondering if there's more that I, a common Caucasian dude from Utah County, currently recently RM at BYU, can do to better follow the scripture, bear one another's burdens, mourn with those that mourn, and comfort those that stand in need of comfort. So I love these questions, and I love the sentiment that they articulate. And I think that's exactly right. What I hope, what my wish is, and I sort of just wrote it up. And if any of you follow the Faith Matters blog, they asked me to kind of articulate a position on race, which I think will be posted sometime this coming week. And this is just from my conclusion of that. But what I wish is that what we could do as Latter-day Saints is simply learn from our racial history and use it to stand in a place of empathy. Rather than get defensive, rather than try to justify it, what if we owned it? What if we owned it? What if we said, hey, we got this wrong, but we've learned from our mistakes? And because we experienced racism or racialization at the hands of outsiders, denigrated as not white enough, we understand at least some degree what that feels like. And because we engaged in racism on the inside, we understand what that looks like and now understand its consequences so that we can better stand in places of empathy today and lead out in issues of racial justice rather than dragging our feet or feeling hobbled by our own racial past. I think that's the way forward. I wish we were willing to do so as Latter-day Saints. And if the leadership in your congregation isn't, here's what I'm hearing. When racial violence happens, I hear Black Latter-day Saints say they show up to church and no one even mentions it in a prayer. No one mentions it in a lesson. Be that person, even if your leadership isn't. Be that person. Be that person who's willing to stand in places of empathy, to say, hey, I see you. I recognize what's taking place. And racism is wrong. Let's be a part of the solution. So in my estimation, it's much more profitable to learn from our collective history rather than defend or deny it. What lessons can it teach? Latter-day Saints experienced racialization at the hands of outsiders and engaged in racism on the inside. What better people then to lead out on issues of racial inequality and social justice? Rather than being hobbled by our past racism, what if we owned it and used our shared history to stand in places of empathy? What if we were willing to work against racial injustice because it happened to us? And what if we were willing to speak up and stand up against systemic racism because we engaged in it and have come to understand its consequences? What if we were willing, like Jesus, to claim all flesh as our own? And that's a reference to Doctrine and Covenants, where Jesus Christ says to Joseph Smith, all flesh is mine, and I am no respecter of persons. Christ himself says he is no respecter of persons. So if he's not a respecter of persons, why should we lay the blame for the racial priesthood and temple restrictions at his feet rather than at the feet of the leadership, the very mortal leadership, who historical evidence demonstrates were the ones who put it in place in fits and starts across the course of the 19th century. So what if we were willing, like Jesus, to claim all flesh, no matter its color, as our own, and be willing to stand in places of empathy? To me, that's what this gospel vision is all about. The June 1978 revelation returned us to our universal roots. That expansive racial vision in the 19th century, we chased after whiteness for 130 years, and in June 1978, we were restored to our universal roots. And that's how I see the LDS racial story. So, Allie, that's all the questions that came in through the registration system. So that's what I have planned.
Yeah. So, and while you were talking, there's been some good questions, and some other members of the discussion, have done a good job in responding to some of them. So how about this? How about if there's a question that you didn't feel was answered, if you can just write that again so I don't have to, scroll back and check out some. Okay, so there's one that was really interesting. So do you know if the church is doing something as we send missionaries out, especially to Black Africa or to the South, or really anywhere, because as we know, we have Black members everywhere. Is the church doing something to better prepare these missionaries that you know of?
So I'm not aware of anything actually happening by the missionary department. But you know what? That's, I've made that suggestion before. I think it's probably time to make that suggestion again. what I am aware of, I think we're living through a moment wherein the way that we tell our own story is changing. And, it's painful. We're losing people as a result because the narrative is getting more messy and more complicated. And I think that's healthy. So what I am aware of is that, for example, seminaries and institutes are addressing the race and the priesthood essay. And so I think the rising generation are being taught a more complicated story than, for example, when I grew up a Latter-day Saint. But I'm not aware of anything specifically for missionaries. I wish there was. I've been asked, for example, to perform some seminary training in Utah County and in Davis County, even the UVU Institute, to help them know how to better address race and LDS church history so that the rising generation are better prepared and better trained. So that's what I'm aware of, not aware of missionaries, but seminaries and institutes at least. And BYU also, they have a Foundations of the Restoration course where they deal with all the gospel topics essays. And so therefore they are engaging with the race and the priesthood essay.
Right. So there's another question. So currently there's a post being shared, so it's a current widely shared post on social media detailing the struggles of early Latter-day Saints, saying that my people were murdered, raped, starved, driven out, hunted, and so on. But then the quote is, they prosper because of hard work and dedication and are good, upstanding citizens. So it's kind of a post to draw parallels between the hardships of the early members and then the hardships of Black members or Black people in this country. What's a good response to this concern of trying to kind of compare the two?
Yeah, so I think our own history can be a source of empathy. When I read that post, however, that's not how it was being used. I think we need to be really careful. We shouldn't in any way suggest that anything that Latter-day Saints endured, and Latter-day Saints endured in a state-sanctioned extermination order. I'm not denying that. Some Latter-day Saints in the 19th century were driven 3 and 4 times from their homes. They were never enslaved. They were never beaten. It was never legal to castrate them if they ran away. Do we really need to go through the horrors of what African Americans endured? And then the end of that post also just sort of said, well, pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps, and we overcame, so can you. It's written from a perspective of white superiority. That's racism. So the post itself is a perpetuation of racism rather than a solution to it. The tone and the perspective give us an indication of that. It was written from the perspective of superiority, not from the perspective of empathy. If we can use our own history, I think we need to do so. I think that's a part of the solution. But doing so means, hey, recognizing we sometimes got it wrong, recognizing that we sometimes experience racialization at the hands of outsiders. So, hey, how can we use that to stand in a place of empathy and listen rather than tell people what to do?
Yeah, excellent. Okay, here's another one in the chat. It says, I've seen a petition for a public apology by the members of the church. Since an apology from leaders has not yet come, what do you think about that? Okay, so say that again. It was about a petition for a public apology. Okay. Yeah, so, I think that was really heartfelt and well-intentioned. I think that's Latter-day Saints in the pew who are saying, hey, if Latter-day Saint leaders from the pulpit aren't going to do this, this is a part of our faith community as well. So we recognize, the racism of the past.
we at least want to stand in a place that demonstrates our willingness to try to move forward by confessing and repenting, as the institution itself teaches. So, I think it's a good faith gesture. Are apologies healing? I believe they are. I believe they can be powerful. So I think members were attempting to at least bring their power to bear on that count. Will it have the same impact as if the LDS hierarchy does so? No, it won't. But I think it's an effort to try to help, to try to move forward.
Okay, so I'm looking through here. Alice, you were telling me to ask Elizabeth's question. Okay, so is it in the 19th century, wasn't it encouraged for white Mormon patriarchs to marry plural wives of various ethnicities? Why was that, quote unquote, race mixing okay, but not for Black Mormon men to marry white women?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my book, I have 2 chapters on red, white, and Mormon, and 4 chapters on black, white, and Mormon. And the racial trajectory of both of those are really different, and I think it's really important for us to understand. So the Book of Mormon is seen as, in the 19th century, amongst Latter-day Saint leaders, as a history of Native Americans. And so Brigham Young and other leaders, as they sent Latter-day Saint missionaries to missionize amongst Native peoples, actually instructed them to seek Native American wives, to intermarry amongst them as a part of racial uplift. So bring Native peoples with us in our journey towards whiteness. And Brigham Young actually uses Book of Mormon language. This will make them white and delightsome. So intermarrying amongst Native Americans makes them more white, was the idea. And intermarrying amongst people of Black African descent makes white people more black and brings this racial curse upon them. And so you have 2 different trajectories for Native Americans versus African Americans. That's why Utah never has a law that prohibits white Native American intermarriage, but other Western states do. But Utah has a law that prohibits white African American interracial marriages and white Asian marriages after the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Western states are passing laws against marrying amongst Chinese and people of Asian descent as well. And in 1888, Utah passes that, but never one against Native American. And it's that theological notion that Native Americans are fallen descendants of ancient Israel. They're in need of uplift. And it's, especially in the 19th century, that's seen as not just gospel uplift, but racial uplift. And racial intermarriage is one way of accomplishing that in the minds of 19th century Latter-day Saints.
Okay, excellent. Okay, there's just a few more here. So is there any history of prominent white Mormon leaders adopting children of color?
I'm not aware of prominent white Mormon leaders adopting children of color. Mitt Romney, I believe, has an adopted grandchild. He's a prominent Mormon, not necessarily a prominent Mormon leader. In the 19th century, I am not aware of that. So no, but Sally Kanash is a Native American who is adopted into the Brigham Young household and will eventually marry Chief Kanash. She was, according to Brigham Young's account, when the Latter-day Saints arrive in the Great Basin, remember, Native American slavery predates them by 100 years in the Great Basin, and what Native Americans are accustomed to doing with Europeans is trading enslaved women and children to Europeans for manufactured goods. And within a couple of weeks of the Latter-day Saint arrival in the Great Basin, Latter-day Saints say that Native Americans brought a couple of children to them, presented them, and wanted the Latter-day Saints to buy them. When the Latter-day Saints refused, they said, well, if you don't buy them, we'll kill them. And the Latter-day Saints didn't believe them. According to Latter-day Saint accounts, we don't have the Native American account, right? But Latter-day Saints say they killed one of the children, and to save the other child's life, Charles Decker, who's Brigham Young's son-in-law, purchases it, and then Brigham Young raises her in his household, and she eventually will marry Chief Kanash. So there's that example, but I'm not aware of a leader adopting an African-American child. Native Americans, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you address the practice of placing Native Americans in white homes during a time in the not that distant past?
Yeah, so the Indian Student Placement Program, once again, I think is a part of this bigger kind of notion of how Native Americans are viewed in Latter-day Saint theology as fallen descendants of ancient Israel in need of redemption. So there's paternalism bound up in it, there's racism bound up in it, and the Indian Student Placement Program was simply designed to provide an education for Native American children on reservations who might not have that opportunity otherwise. So they would be placed in homes of white Latter-day Saints during the school year so that they could attend school and then return back to their families on reservations when school is out. And Matthew Garrett has a book out on it, so it's a full-length treatment of it. The results are mixed. Some Native peoples who went through the program to the present still talk about what a great opportunity it was to provide new opportunities for them and see it as a good thing. Others talk about it in really negative terms. Some have filed lawsuit claiming to be sexual abused by their foster families. So it runs the gamut of experiences. And I think at the very least, it was disruptive. Being taken from their families, sometimes not willfully, so feeling displaced from what they'd grown up around and placed in a new family during the school year, and then back and forth between cultures, sort of made some of them feel like they were in between cultures, not fully accepted by either one. So certainly a mixed bag, and I know some Native American scholars in the present really don't like it at all. Matthew Garrett's book is the first full-length treatment of it, so I would recommend that as a resource.
Excellent. Let's see. Okay. Is it speaking ill of our past leaders' racism to acknowledge they were wrong? Can you be called out on that? I don't want to be kicked out or disciplined, but I think it's important to talk about.
Yeah, I don't want to get anyone in trouble. But let me just say, I don't think it's wrong at all. And if you understand the history, you can say, well, Orson Pratt called out Brigham Young in 1852. Orson Pratt spoke out stridently against the slave code and actually advocated for Black voting rights. So here's an argument that I frequently hear is, well, everyone was racist back then, and they're just a product of their time. I'm a historian, and I teach my students about presentism, meaning that we can't superimpose the present on the past. We have to understand the past on its own terms. But to try to justify and excuse racism in the past by using that argument is a misuse of that notion of presentism. And here's why. Because people in the past, Orson Pratt, for example, recognized it as wrong and spoke out against it. He was also a product of the 19th century and argued for Black voting rights. As long as there has been slavery, there has been anti-slavery society. So people in the past also recognize slavery as wrong. People in the past also recognize racism as wrong. So you can't just easily dismiss it as, oh, those are all people in the past. And remember, Joseph Smith approved Black priesthood ordination. He was also a product of his time. So when Brigham Young rejects it, right, then it's not just easily excused as, well, people were just racist back then, because people were also not racist back then, and people also spoke out against it back then. So I don't think there's anything wrong with speaking out against it today. Racism has been defined as a sin. The first presidency has condemned all racism, even in the church. And so articulating it as racism, even when a prophet engages in racism, it's still a sin, whether that be Brigham Young or Nephi in the Book of Mormon. When prophets engage in racism, it's still a sin. So there's nothing wrong with pointing out, hey, Brigham Young was engaged in racism. And here's another thing to consider. Latter-day Saints believe in eternal progression. Do we really think Brigham Young is somewhere in the eternities stuck on his position from 1852 and upset that we aren't defending his racism from 1852? We believe in eternal progression. We don't think he's progressed beyond his position from 1852 and that he wants us to move beyond it and repent. For heaven's sake, I think he wants us to move well beyond it. So let him progress. We don't need to circle the wagons to defend Brigham Young. I think he's progressed beyond his racism and repented, and he wants us to do the same. So let's let him. When we see people encircling the wagons to defend Brigham Young, I just don't understand it. I believe in eternal progression, and I think Brigham Young has moved well beyond where he was in 1852. So we should let him.
Definitely agreed. I like that. Okay, here's another one. My understanding is that early prophets were establishing protocols of non-mixing in order to comply with local laws. However, I had always thought of words from the prophets as doctrine. Would you say that non-mixing was a doctrine, protocol, or a mistake? And I think you probably answered that a little bit with this last one, but if you have anything else to say.
Yeah, I would say a mistake. I mean, I think it's a product of the cultural context of the time. Like I said before, I see Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and those leaders who are speaking out against race mixing more as more American than anything uniquely Mormon. That's the American context. Peggy Pasco's book, What Comes Naturally, is the best book on race mixing in America and laws against interracial mixing. And she documents every state in the nation, and the vast majority of states in the nation have laws against race mixing. It's really that fear of darkening the white race and making it unfit for democracy. So I see those statements as a part of the cultural milieu that Latter-day Saint leaders were born into and grew up in, and it's really a reflection of that. Spencer W. Kimball, after the 1978 revelation, Mary Sturlockston, who writes the book So Rebellious, she recounts getting a personal interview with him, and she had been dating a white Latter-day Saint and was experiencing pushback from her fellow Latter-day Saints, and she received an appointment with Spencer W. Kimball and asked him face to face, and he said, "It's not a sin." With tears in his eyes, he said, "No, there's nothing wrong with it." And after the 1978 revelation, interracial couples were being sealed in the temple almost immediately. So I think it was a part of the cultural context that we just simply, imported into our Mormonism.
Okay, excellent. So the church typically tries to maintain a relatively apolitical stance, but has also willing to use money and political pressure to achieve its aims. Would rectifying our past racist mistakes require the church to push for anti-racist legislation, for example, reparations?
I think all of those things would be really, really helpful. The church has made $1 million donation to the Charleston Museum, obviously working now with the NAACP. I think we're all waiting, including the NAACP, to see what kind of fruits that bears. I think all of those kind of things would be a great way of overcoming what's happened in the past. Would they have to actively seek anti-racism legislation? I'm not sure that they would, you're asking me to predict, but I'm not sure that they would go that far. I'm just kind of skeptical, but I think most Latter-day Saints would be pleased with an open acknowledgement of the past, the wrongs of the past, and a vision of moving forward in notions of racial justice and social justice. I remain hopeful.
Yes, I think as do we all who are kind of fighting this good fight, I guess, what you can say. So I don't see any more questions. If anybody has one last minute question, go ahead and take off your microphone and you can tell us. But if not, I guess we'll thank you for your time.
I have a question. Where it can read the full text of Orson Pratt's speech.
So that speech I uncovered with the help of, my request at the Church History Library first uncovered that with the help of Jean Carruth, who transcribed it from its Pittman shorthand. As a result, the LDS Church History Library is allowing LeJean and myself and Christopher Rich to publish it as a documentary history. And we're trying to finish that right now and allow us to be the first to publish it. And once it's published, they'll make it available. They've been generous enough to protect it. It sort of rarely happens as a historian to find something that has never been seen before. And so they are protecting it for us until we get our publication out. The book is almost done. We're close to a completed draft, and then it will be published. And then the Church History Library will also make it publicly available. They've made Brigham Young's 5th of February speech, which LeJean transcribed from the Pittman shorthand. Watt actually done his own transcription, but not the complete version. So that's available at the Church History Library website, as well as the 27th of January speech. We'll publish those in our book as well, and we'll lay out the timeline of the legislative session. And there's an Indian indenture bill during that same session as well, and a debate that takes place that had never been transcribed about that. So all of those speeches will be published. We're getting close.
And Paul, we have a couple of requests to share your quote on social media. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so. Faith Matters, if any of you are familiar with that group, this is an essay they asked me to write for their website. It will be posted, I think, on Wednesday. So my only hesitation is, they're going to post it on Wednesday. So if you can wait until Wednesday, I think that would be preferable. Just because I shared it here before they have a chance to post it on their website, and I don't want to upset anyone there.
Well, we definitely feel really special.
Can I ask a question, Paul?
Sure.
Hello?
Yes.
I sent it to you, but anyway, I'm curious about your response to Joanna Brooks' book, because the first chapter is very powerful, and certainly she gives a different picture than you do. I mean, she uses just different language as well, but of the degree of unanimity and unity that the leaders of the church had in Utah in those before 1852, they sound much more uniformly racist, with the small exception of Orson Pratt, but pretty emphatically unified in that. What do you think she's exaggerated this, and have you commented on this anywhere publicly since her book came out?
I haven't commented on it publicly. book came out, Dialogue asked me to review it, and they will be posting my review there. So I would just say, it's not a comprehensive history, and I think it's so she articulates two methodologies: critical analysis and historical research. And I think she's much better at the critical analysis than the historical research. And so I think it's more a call to action than it is a comprehensive history. And what she misses, in my estimation, is race as something ascribed from the outside as well as aspired to from within. And the only thing, so her focus is on the aspiration from within, aspiration for whiteness from within. And this is the context of ascribed from the outside, so the outside context of how people are talking about Mormons. And, her 19th century chapters are just much more brief. She's more weighted towards the 20th century. What I see her doing is selecting examples. She drops us into these moments where decisions could have gone either way, and yet those decisions went in the way of reasserting whiteness over protecting fellow Black Latter-day Saints. So as a result, you don't get the complexity of the things that I articulated because she's dropping us into the moments of decision where they chose whiteness.
So did you write that dialogue book review and will it come out? Is that happening?
Yes, it will. I think towards the 1st of July, it's going to be It's going to be posted at Dialogue. I think electronically first before it comes out in the print edition. And they actually asked a couple of other people, Black Latter-day Saints, also to respond to it. So I think it's kind of a round table. So mine won't be the only review. There will be 3, I think, total.
Thank you so much. And thanks for tonight.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks so much.
I have a question, Paul.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So obviously you don't represent the Board of Trustees for the church educational system, but with all of the protests and push for systemic change racially, what is your take as a historian and as a member of the church and as somebody who specializes in what you've discussed already on changing the name of the BYUs or removing some of the statues that we have of our past prophets and other church leaders that had special prominence in Utah?
Yeah, I've been following that. I guess just as a pragmatist, I'm skeptical that anyone will realistically entertain the idea of changing Brigham Young University. But that's just, my reading of attempting to read the tea leaves. It seems like maybe a step too far. But I am hopeful that there is momentum on the Abraham Smoot building. And in fact, before the current moment that we're in, I did a social media kind of engagement, which Peggy Fletcher Stack picked up and published in the Salt Lake Tribune. And it got a little bit of attention. But this has been, about a year ago, the Salt Lake City Cemetery was attempting to put a marker on the grave of an enslaved man named Tom, who had been enslaved to Abraham Smoot, who was mayor of Salt Lake at the time. This is before he moved to Utah County and became a benefactor at BYU. And they reached out to me through the Century of Black Mormons project to see if we had any information on Tom. And at the time, I didn't know that Tom had been baptized. And so I said no, simply because we didn't believe that Tom had been baptized. And then I had gone into the archive looking for someone else. And this was just a few weeks before, I think it was within a month of Tom's proposed headstone dedication. I went into the archive and, it was one of those moments where, you feel like the cosmos is in your favor. I had, I think, about 4 or 5 microfilm reels, and the Sugar House Ward was the last one that I was going to look at. And I got the sense that I should look at this Sugar House Ward first. And within 5 minutes, I had found Tom's baptismal record. He was baptized in 1854. He was brought here by Hayden Wells Church, baptized in 1854, but arrived in 1852, the fall of 1852. So as I put these dates together, what I realized then is that he was then transferred to Abraham Smoot, became Abraham Smoot's slave, and he died in 1862, 2 months before Congress would have freed him. And what I realized was that Abraham Smoot was his bishop, and Tom would have been reliant upon Republicans in Congress to free him, not his own bishop and enslaver, his fellow Latter-day Saint. And, I just kind of had this emotional kind of response to all of this and kind of wrote it up on social media, and Peggy picked it up. And, I ended by saying, hey, BYU, what are we going to do about this? How do we also commemorate Tom alongside Abraham Smoot? I'm hopeful that if anything happens at BYU, that there will be something about the Smoot administration building, some way that BYU will recognize those who were enslaved in Utah Territory, and also recognize at least some complexity with Brigham Young and his views on race as well. So if you're not bringing the statue down, can we contextualize it, right? Can we have a monument? So some southern locations have done this. In Georgia, there's a law against bringing down Confederate statues. So some local municipalities have constructed interpretive markers next to Confederate statues and said, these are products of the lost cause. These are products of white supremacy in the 1920s. They're not about commemorating the Civil War. They're about reasserting white supremacy. And they, contextualize those. So are there things that BYU could do to tell a more complicated story? And I think the answer is 100% yes. And I hope that the conversations that come out of BYU produce some of those type of results.
Okay, very excellent. Okay, so and the only other thing that I'm seeing here is people are wondering, how to follow you on social media besides the Century of Black Mormons. I posted that in the chat. Are there other discussions that you know about that people who are interested can maybe follow on social media?
So we have a Twitter account for Century of Black Mormons. So please follow us there. We just tweeted today, Sarah Ann Mode Hofheinz is the earliest known person of Black African descent to receive temple admission, 1845 Nauvoo Temple. You can read her story at Century of Black Mormons. So follow us on Twitter. We also have Century of Black Mormons on Facebook. And I'm on Twitter at W. Paul Reeve. And I can't remember the Twitter handle for Century of Black Mormons. It's a little bit complicated, but if you even just type in Century of Black Mormons at Twitter, you should find our Twitter feed. So I think those locations are where you can follow these kind of discussions.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think we did 2 hours. I think that's good. If anyone has any last minute questions, but if not, thank you so much. I really, really, really appreciate you taking your time and teach us. And can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you, Ali, for the invitation and for putting it together. It's really been my honor. Thank you, everyone, for who participated. Really an honor to talk with you tonight.
And we'll get this recording out to those that are interested. And that's okay, Paul, if we share it on social media?
Yes. Yeah, that's fine.
Of course. So we don't ruin the quote. Okay. Right. Thank you, everyone.